The red dress was an act of defiance against the quiet tyranny of her own life. It hung in the hushed interior of Margaret's closet, a slash of defiant crimson against the muted sea of sensible beiges, navies, and grays. It was silk, the kind that whispered promises against the skin, and she had bought it 3 weeks ago on a rare, reckless impulse. She'd seen it in a boutique window, a splash of impossible color on a rainy Tuesday, and had imagined Benjamin's reaction. "You look beautiful, Mom," he would say, his eyes crinkling at the corners in that way that still made her heart ache with the fierce, primal love. He'd say it with the same genuine surprise he used to have when she'd dress up for his high school graduation or the awards banquet for his first big real estate deal. Back when her presence felt like a prerequisite for his success, not an obligation to be managed. At 62, the dress felt both too young and achingly appropriate. It was a garment for a woman who had not yet surrendered, a woman who still believed she could command a room, or at the very least, the full attention of her only son. She slipped it from its padded hanger, the fabric cool and fluid in her hands, a stark contrast to the brittle hope she held in her chest. As she slid it on, the silk flowed over the gentle curves of her body, a body that had borne and nurtured him, a body that now felt increasingly invisible to him. In the full-length mirror, Margaret Waters stared back at herself. The reflection showed a woman who had mastered the fine art of camouflage. Her silver-streaked hair was elegantly coiffed, her makeup meticulously applied to hide the faint shadows of sleepless nights. Her lips painted a shade of rose that suggested cheerfulness she did not feel. She was a portrait of graceful aging, a masterpiece of quiet endurance. The name, Margaret Waters, still belonged to her, though she had been divorced from Benjamin's father for 15 years. Some identities, she mused, have a longer shelf life than a marriage. The identity of Mom, however, felt like it was dissolving day by day. Her phone buzzed on the vanity, a sharp electronic summons. She snatched it up, her heart performing the same embarrassing flutter it always did when his name appeared. A text from Benjamin. "Looking forward to lunch, Mom. The usual place, 1 p.m. That was all. No loving preamble, no exclamation points, just the stark facts of their appointment. Still, it was enough. It was a thread, and she clung to it. At 35, he was a man of consequence, a successful developer with a penthouse downtown and a life curated for social media, all perpetual sunshine and strategic success. But to her, he was still the boy with his father's stubborn jaw and her grandmother's startlingly green eyes, the baby whose colic had kept her walking the floors for endless nights. She arrived at Romano's 15 minutes early, clutching her purse like a shield. The restaurant was an old friend, a place of countless shared memories. It was where they'd celebrated his acceptance into college, where he'd brought his first serious girlfriend to meet her, where they had reestablished their fragile bond after the raw ugliness of the divorce. Today, Romano's was a riot of Mother's Day sentiment. The air hummed with a warm, chaotic energy, thick with the scent of garlic, fresh baked bread, and the heady perfume of roses and lilies that adorned every table. Laughter echoed up the dark wood walls, the clinking of glasses punctuating the happy din. The hostess, a young woman with kind, perceptive eyes, smiled warmly. "Happy Mother's Day, just for one today?" The question, though innocent, was a small, sharp prick. "Oh no," Margaret said, forcing a bright smile. "My son is meeting me, Benjamin Scott. We have a usual table by the window." "Of course, Mrs. Waters, this way." She was led to the small table for two, a pristine white square in a sea of celebratory chaos. The hostess arranged the napkins with practiced efficiency. "Your son will be joining you?" she asked, a confirmation, not a question. "Yes, any minute now." The lie came easily, smoothed by months of practice. "He's just running late. He's caught in traffic. He had a last-minute call." She had a whole repertoire of excuses for him, a defense attorney for a son who never bothered to mount his own defense. 1 o'clock came and went. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the single perfect rosebud in the vase on her table. Margaret smoothed the napkin in her lap, her gaze fixed on the door, a silent vigil that was becoming more and more a part of their relationship. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Rosa, whose face was a compassionate map of other people's disappointments, approached with patient sympathy. "Would you like to order an appetizer while you wait, ma'am? Or perhaps a glass of wine?" "He's just running late," Margaret repeated, the words tasting like ash. "You know how traffic can be on a holiday." Rosa nodded, but her eyes held a knowing gentleness that was almost worse than pity. "Of course. I'll bring you some water and bread." By 1:30, the knot in Margaret's stomach had tightened into a cold, hard stone. The initial buzz of the restaurant had settled into the steady rhythm of main courses and shared desserts. The glances from other tables were no longer casual. They were imbued with a soft, uncomfortable pity. At the table next to hers, a woman Margaret's age was opening a velvet jewelry box, her face glowing with the particular radiant contentment of being cherished. Her daughter and son-in-law watched her, their faces mirroring her delight. The scene was so intimate, so effortlessly loving, that Margaret had to look away, a hot blush of shame creeping up her neck. Her phone remained dark and silent on the white tablecloth, a small black tombstone marking a dead hope. She ordered the salmon, Benjamin's favorite, telling herself he would arrive just as the food came and they would laugh about his terrible timing. The lie was so thin now it was transparent, but it was all she had. Rosa brought the entree, placing it before her with a quiet reverence, as if serving a final meal. "Are you dining alone today?" Rosa asked, her voice soft, giving Margaret an opportunity to retract her earlier fiction. Margaret opened her mouth to repeat the lie, but the words wouldn't come. The effort of maintaining the facade was suddenly too much. The truth sat heavy in her chest, a physical weight. "Yes," she whispered, the admission a crack in her careful composure. Rosa nodded once, a gesture of profound, unspoken understanding. There was no judgment in her eyes, only the shared wisdom of a woman who had seen the entire spectrum of human celebration and disappointment play out across her tables. "The salmon looks perfect," she said gently. "Chef's specialty." Margaret ate mechanically, her fork moving from the plate to her mouth without conscious thought. The perfectly cooked fish, the roasted asparagus, the lemon dill sauce, it all tasted of nothing. The warmth of the restaurant, once a comforting embrace, now felt oppressive. All that joy, all that effusive love pressed in on her, threatening to shatter her fragile control. To distract herself from the symphony of maternal bliss surrounding her, she pulled out her phone. She would scroll through social media, a mindless dive into the curated lives of others, anything to avoid the reality of her own empty table. She opened Instagram, her thumb swiping through pictures of smiling families and bouquets of flowers, and that's when she saw it. It was a new post on Benjamin's story, uploaded 20 minutes ago. The timestamp itself was a small, cruel twist of the knife. He hadn't been stuck in traffic. He had been composing a caption. The photo was bright, professionally lit, taken at Les Bernardines, the obscenely expensive seafood palace across town that he knew she considered pretentious. He was smiling broadly, a wide, unthinking grin of pure happiness. His arm was wrapped tightly around the shoulders of a woman Margaret recognized instantly. Christine, his stepmother, his father's second wife, who had swooped in with her perfect figure, her perfect dinner parties, and her perfect ability to make Richard feel young again. The photo was a punch to the gut. The caption was the blow that broke her ribs. It read, "Mother's Day lunch with my real mother. Grateful for the woman who taught me what family means." And below, the hashtags, blessed, real mom, grateful. The phone slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the table with a sharp, percussive sound that seemed to silence the entire restaurant for a heartbeat. Several diners turned to look, their expressions shifting from idle curiosity to genuine concern as they registered the look on her face. Her carefully constructed mask had not just cracked, it had disintegrated, revealing the raw, unvarnished agony beneath. Real mother. The words echoed in her mind, each syllable a fresh slap. She thought of the 35 years, the nights spent rocking a colicky committee until dawn, the soccer games where she'd screamed herself hoarse from the sidelines, his name a constant cheer. On the parent-teacher conferences, the scraped knees, the broken hearts that she had mended with ice cream and patience. She thought of the divorce, of how she had swallowed her own pain and fury to shield him from the worst of his father's casual cruelty, ensuring he still felt loved and secure. She had worked 3 jobs, a receptionist in the morning, a library clerk in the afternoon, and a medical transcription at night to pay for the college tuition his father had deemed an unnecessary expense. She had poured her life into the foundation of his, brick by painful brick, and he had just bulldozed it all for a hashtag. "Ma'am, are you all right?" The decision, once made in the cold blue light of pre-dawn clarity, was an anesthetic. It numbed the throbbing wound of Mother's Day, replacing the agony with a sharp, crystalline purpose. Margaret did not weep as she walked through the rooms of her house the next morning. She did not linger over photographs or touch the worn arm of the chair where she'd read Benjamin bedtime stories. She moved like a surveyor, an appraiser of her own life, her eyes cataloging not memories, but assets. The house, this handsome colonial on a desirable, tree-lined street, was the largest of them. For 35 years, it had been a home, a sanctuary, a container for love and laughter and tears. Today, it was capital. She bypassed the well-known real estate agents whose faces beamed from bus benches and local magazines, the ones Richard or Benjamin might know. Instead, she chose a smaller, hungrier boutique firm from a neighboring town, one run by a woman named Sarah Gable. Sarah was in her late 30s, sharp, stylish, and exuding an energy that suggested she had no time for sentimentality. She was perfect. When Sarah arrived, her eyes, professionally trained to assess value in seconds, swept over the property with an approving glint. "It's a beautiful home, Mrs. Waters," she said, her voice crisp. "Great bones, classic architecture. The neighborhood is highly sought after. With a little staging, some fresh paint, we could start the bidding high." Margaret, holding a cup of black coffee, shook her head. "No staging, no fresh paint. We sell it as is." Sarah's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. As is can sometimes signal desperation to buyers. It might depress the price. "It will signal urgency," Margaret corrected, her tone leaving no room for debate. "I want it sold. Fast. I am not interested in hosting open houses for curious neighbors. I want qualified buyers only, private showings by appointment. And I want the sign on the lawn by noon tomorrow." Sarah studied her client. Her professional curiosity piqued. She was accustomed to sellers who agonized over every detail, who wept while packing their children's height charts, who wrote heartfelt letters to prospective buyers about the happy memories infused in the walls. Margaret Waters exhibited none of that. She discussed the property with the detached air of an executor liquidating a distant relative's estate. There was no grief in her eyes, only a formidable, almost unnerving resolve. "All right, Mrs. Waters," Sarah said, her own voice taking on a new level of respect. "Urgency it is. I'll have the listing active by morning and the sign delivered." The sign arrived the next day at 11:30. It was a simple, declarative statement in bold red and white. For sale. The workmen hammered it into the manicured lawn with 3 metallic thuds that echoed down the quiet street. Each thud felt like a gavel strike, signaling the end of an era. Margaret watched from the living room window. She felt no pang of loss. She felt only the clean, satisfying click of a chess piece being moved into a strategic position. Her neighbor, Donna Pelosi, a pragmatic 70-year-old widow who communicated mostly in wry observations and freshly baked biscotti, was in her garden. She saw the sign, straightened up from her rose bushes, and stared at it for a long moment. Then she looked toward Margaret's window and gave a single, emphatic nod. It was a gesture of unequivocal approval, a silent acknowledgement that she had seen the long, slow war and was now witnessing a decisive battle. The calls began exactly 3 hours later, as Margaret knew they would. The first was a text from Benjamin, the digital vanguard of his impending panic. "Donna just called me, said there's a for sale sign on the lawn. Is this some kind of joke?" Margaret let the text sit for 10 minutes, let him stew in the uncertainty. When her phone finally rang, she answered on the first ring, her voice placid. "Hello, Benjamin." "Mom, what the hell is going on? You're selling the house? Why wouldn't you talk to me about this first?" "There was nothing to discuss. It is my house. I have decided to sell it." "It's the family home. It's where I grew up. All our memories are there." He sputtered, his voice rising. He was reaching for the sentimental lovers, the ones that had always worked before. "Yes, many memories, but memories don't pay property taxes, and they are not a transferable asset. The house is a possession, my possession. I am liquidating it." There was a stunned silence on his end. He was accustomed to her emotional responses, to the easy hooks of guilt and nostalgia. Her dispassionate, business-like tone left him without a script. "But what about all my stuff in the attic? My yearbooks, my baseball trophies?" "I suggest you make arrangements to collect them within the next 2 weeks. The new owners will want the property vacant upon closing." "New owners? Mom, you can't be serious. You're having some kind of breakdown because of Mother's Day. You're not thinking clearly." Insisted, his voice now laced with condescending concern. "On the contrary, Benjamin," she replied, a razor's edge in her voice. "For the first time in a long time, I am thinking with absolute clarity. This is not a negotiation. This is a notification. I have things to do. Goodbye." She ended the call before he could respond, placing the phone on the counter with a steady hand. One down. The second call, less than an hour later, was from his father. Richard's tone was not of concern. It was that of outrage. His bluster came through the phone like static. "Margaret, what is this nonsense Benjamin is telling me? You've put the house on the market?" "Hello, Richard," she said, the polite greeting a stark contrast to his fury. "To be precise, I have put my house on the market, the one that was awarded to me, free and clear, in our divorce settlement 15 years ago. I believe you signed the documents." "Don't be deliberately obtuse. That house is a landmark. It represents 30 years of my hard work. I chose that lot. I approved the blueprints. Selling it reflects on me, on our family's legacy." "Your legacy is Benjamin, and a very successful second marriage, I hear. This house is simply real estate, and its value has appreciated nicely, for which I suppose I should thank your initial investment. Now, I will be the one to capitalize on it." "You're doing this to spite me, aren't you? Because of Christine? This is a petty, vindictive act, Margaret, and it's beneath you." "What's beneath me, Richard, is continuing to live my life according to the expectations of a family that no longer includes me in any meaningful way. You are worried about how this reflects on you. Benjamin is worried about his childhood trophies. Neither of you have asked me a single question about my well-being or my reasons. You have only expressed your own indignation. That tells me everything I need to know. The decision is final. I will not have it." "You will have no say in it whatsoever," she countered, her voice dropping to a near whisper, which was somehow more menacing than who's shouting. "The deed is in my name and my name alone. I'm sure your lawyers can confirm that for you should you feel the need to waste your money. Goodbye, Richard." She hung up on his sputtering rage. 2 down. The anger from the men was predictable, an affront to their sense of ownership and control. The final call, she knew, would be the most difficult. It would be cloaked in the insidious language of empathy. As expected, Christine's name appeared on her screen an hour later. She let it ring 3 times,
took a deep, fortifying breath, and answered, "Margaret, it's Christine. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "It's a busy time." She kept her tone neutral, professional. "Oh, Margaret, I feel like there's been a terrible, terrible misunderstanding. Benjamin and Richard are beside themselves with worry. We all are. I want you to know from the bottom of my heart how sorry I am about that Instagram post. It was thoughtless. I was just so flattered I wasn't thinking about how it would look, how it might make you feel." It was a masterclass in deflection, a non-apology apology. "I'm sorry for how you felt, not for what I did." "Your feelings have been noted," she said, her voice chillingly formal. Christine faltered, the warmth in her voice wavering. If we could all sit down, you, me, Benjamin, we could talk this through. I know we can get us this. Selling the house seems like such a drastic, irreversible step, born out of pain. We want to help you through this pain." This was the attack Margaret had girding for. The attempt to reframe her deliberate, strategic action as an emotional, hysterical breakdown. The offer to help was an offer to manage, to sedate, to bring her back into the fold where she could be safely ignored once more. "Let me be perfectly clear, Christine," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the other woman's practiced calm like a shard of glass. "You are not a neutral party here. You are not a mediator. You are the woman my son publicly called his real mother, while abandoning a long-standing plan with me. Your offer to help."
The coordinated phone calls had been a volley, an opening salvo in a war Margaret had declared and her family had yet to understand. In the silence that followed her 3 definitive conversations, they did what they always did. They conferred. They formed a tactical huddle, a closed loop of self-interest and shared delusion, certain they were dealing with a temporary emotional aberration. The conference call was initiated by Richard. Naturally, he saw himself as the patriarch, the chairman of the board of their fractured family, whose authority had been inexplicably challenged. He dialed Benjamin first, who answered with a frantic edge to his voice. "Dad, did you talk to her? She hung up on me. She was talking like a robot. All business. It wasn't her." "Of course it wasn't her," Richard snapped, his impatience a palpable force even through the phone. "It's a classic menopausal breakdown. Your grandmother went through something similar, locked herself in the sunroom for a week with nothing but sherry and romance novels. Margaret's just being more theatrical. She's doing it for attention, Benjamin. It's a cry for help." "I don't know, Dad. This feels different. Colder." Richard sighed, a sound of profound paternal disappointment. "Because you're letting her manipulate you. You always have. You're soft on her. I'm patching in Christine. She'll know how to handle the emotional side of this." Christine's voice joined the call, smooth and placating as ever, though Margaret's parting words had clearly left a crack in her polished veneer. "Richard, Benjamin, hello. I think we need to approach this with compassion and a unified front. Margaret is clearly in a great deal of pain." "She's in a great deal of a snit," Richard corrected. "She's trying to punish us. Selling the house is a symbolic gesture, a temper tantrum with the commission." "But it's a gesture with real-world consequences." Benjamin's voice was strained, the panic beginning to fray its edges. "That house... Dad, we need to talk about the Peterson deal, the access route for Hudson Rise. Lot 47B it's her property. My entire projection for the project assumed we could get an easement without any trouble. I thought, down the line, it would just be part of the family assets we'd manage." A heavy silence fell on the line. Richard was the first to speak, his voice dangerously low. "Are you telling me your 9-figure development deal is dependent on your mother's goodwill? The same mother you just publicly disowned on the internet? I didn't disown her, Benjamin protested weakly. It was a poor choice of words, and I didn't think she'd just go nuclear. I thought she'd get upset, I'd send some flowers, and we'd move on. Like always. Like always, Richard repeated, the words dripping with contempt. Well, your sentimentality may have just cost this family a fortune. This is no longer about her feelings. This is a business problem. We need to shut this down legally. We can't do that, Richard, interjected Christine, her therapist's tone returning. We can't go in with lawyers. That will only validate her sense of victimhood and push her farther away. She feels abandoned. We need to show her we haven't abandoned her. We need to surround her with concern, a gentle, persistent pressure. We wait a day or two for her to feel the full weight of what she's done, and then we begin the outreach. Flowers, texts, voicemails, a constant loving reminder that we're here for her when she's ready to be rational again. And in the meantime, some other developer could swoop in and buy the house right out from under us, Benjamin said, his voice tight with anxiety. No one is buying that house in 48 hours, son. Stop panicking, Richard grumbled. Fine, we'll try Christine's touchy-feely approach first. 2 days of radio silence from our end. Let her sit in that empty house and think. Then we begin the gentle pressure. But if she hasn't taken that sign down by the end of the week, I'm calling Marvin at the law firm. We'll see how long her resolution lasts when she gets a letter about competency hearings. They concluded the call, confident in their strategy. They had diagnosed the problem, a woman's emotional hysteria, devised a two-pronged solution, emotional manipulation followed by legal intimidation, and assigned themselves their roles. They were the calm, rational adults managing an unfortunate but temporary crisis. They were the echoes of a foregone conclusion, voices bouncing off the walls of their own echo chamber, utterly failing to comprehend that the person they were talking about no longer existed. While they strategized, Margaret worked. Her dining room had transformed into a command center. The phone, which had begun to buzz intermittently with texts from concerned mutual friends, no doubt prompted by Christine's subtle campaign, was turned face down on a far counter. Each vibration was not a temptation, but a data point, a confirmation of the enemy's movements. She ignored them all. Her focus was singular. The Peterson Project was no longer an abstract concept, a source of her son's pride. It was a target. She spent the first day immersed in the public record. Her laptop screen glowed late into the night, illuminating her face with a pale, determined light. She learned the project's official name was the Hudson Rise Estates. She found the full set of architectural plans and engineering schematics filed with the town planning board. She downloaded geological surveys, environmental impact statements, and traffic flow analyses. She read through hundreds of pages of technical jargon, her mind sharp and clear, absorbing information with a rapacious hunger. She was not just a murdering mother, she was an intelligence analyst. The key, as Benjamin had inadvertently revealed, was access. The engineering report she unearthed confirmed it in dry, technical prose. The sprawling parcel of land was effectively landlocked for the purposes of major construction. The southern border was a state-protected wetland, untouchable. The eastern border was a sheer rock face, a geological feature that would cost millions to blast through. The plans called for a grand, tree-lined entrance boulevard, a selling point for the luxury homes planned within, and that boulevard had to connect to the main road. The only feasible route cut directly through the cluster of older established properties on her street. With a growing sense of cold dread and colder fury, she cross-referenced the property maps with the ownership records. The engineering report listed 3 potential properties for the access easement, lots 45, 46, and 47B.
Lot 45 belonged to an elderly couple who had publicly vowed never to sell. Lot 46 was owned by a family trust in California, notoriously difficult to negotiate with. And Lot 47B. Lot 47B was hers. The realization landed not with a hot flush of betrayal, but with the cold, hard certainty of a mathematical proof. It was the final piece of evidence. Benjamin's casual entitlement, his assumption that her life and property were merely extensions of his own, was not just a character flaw, it was a cornerstone of his business plan. He had been counting on her love, her compliance, her eventual mortality to secure the future of his grand project. He had seen her home not as a sanctuary of his childhood, but as a future ingress-egress point on a blue point. The hurt from Mother's Day had been a wildfire, hot and chaotic. This discovery was different. It was like staring into the core of a glacier, an ancient, profound, and absolute cold. Any lingering wisp of sentimental attachment to the house, to the life it represented, was flash frozen and shattered. Now that she understood her own position, she turned her attention to the competition. Who else wanted this land? The business journals mentioned rival firm, Vance Development Group. She spent the next full day building a dossier on them. She found that Vance Development was smaller, leaner, and more aggressive than Benjamin's legacy-rich company. It was run by a woman named Alana Vance. She found a profile of her in a regional business magazine. The photo showed a woman in her late 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes, dark hair pulled back in a severe style, and a smile that didn't quite reach them. She was a shark in a Chanel suit. The article described her as a brilliant and ruthless strategist who specialized in hostile acquisitions and complex multi-parcel land assemblies. She was known for her creative financing and her unconventional approach to overcoming obstacles. She had started with nothing, fighting her way up in a male-dominated industry. She was, the article concluded, a woman who did not flinch. Margaret read the article 3 times. She studied Alana Vance's face, seeing not an enemy, but a potential language partner. Here was a woman who would understand leverage. Here was a woman who would not misinterpret a strategic move as emotional outburst.
The reply from Alana Vance came in less than 10 minutes. For a moment, Margaret had allowed a flicker of doubt. Perhaps her email was too presumptuous. Perhaps it would be filtered out by an assistant, dismissed as the rambling of a crank. But the subject line that appeared in her inbox was as crisp and direct as the woman in the magazine photograph. Mutually beneficial proposition, Lot 47B. The body of the email was even more concise. Miss Waters, my office, tomorrow, 10 a.m. A car will be sent for you at 9:15, AV. There was no preamble, no polite fluff. It was the communication of a predator who has just scented blood in the water. Margaret felt a surge of adrenaline that was almost intoxicating. This was a language she could speak. She replied with a single word, confirmed. The next morning, Margaret dressed not in the defiant red of a woman seeking to be seen, but in the quiet armor of a woman about to enter a boardroom. She chose a tailored charcoal gray pantsuit, a simple silk shell, and low, practical heels. Her hair was pulled back in a severe chignon, and her makeup was minimal. She was not dressing to be Margaret Waters, Benjamin's emotional mother. She was dressing to be M. Waters, a negotiating entity. At precisely 9:15 a.m., a black Lincoln Town car, its windows darkly tinted, glided to a silent stop at her curb. The driver, a large man in a dark suit, got out and opened the rear door for her without a word. The cushioned leather interior was cool and smelled faintly of expensive polish. As the car pulled away from her quiet suburban street, Margaret did not look back at the house with its garish for sale sign. She looked forward, through the tinted glass, at the city skyline rising in the distance.
Vance Development Group occupied the top 2 floors of a sleek glass and steel tower in downtown White Plains. The lobby was a cavern of minimalist design, all polished concrete, chrome, and abstract art that seemed to hum with silent, nervous energy. The receptionist, a young man with an impossibly sharp haircut, greeted her by name before she could introduce herself and directed her to a private elevator. Alana Vance's office was less an office and more a command deck. One entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling window, offering a panoramic, almost predatory view of the city and the surrounding county. Another wall was covered in a massive, backlit map of the region, dotted with colored pins representing active projects, potential acquisitions, and targeted territories. Margaret Street, her very property, was located in a section of the map that glowed with a faint, aggressive red. Alana Vance was standing by the window, her back to the door, a phone pressed to her ear. She was dressed in a razor-sharp navy dress that seemed custom-molded to her frame. She finished her call with a series of clipped, brutal commands, then turned. Her eyes, a startlingly pale gray, scanned her from head to toe, an assessment that was immediate and entirely unsentimental. "Miss Waters," she said, her voice a low contralto. She did not offer a handshake. Instead, she gestured to one of 2 severe leather chairs positioned before a vast empty glass desk. "Thank you for coming. Coffee?" "No, thank you," Margaret said, her own voice steady. "I'm fine." Alana circled the desk and sat, her posture radiating an almost tangible power. She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the pristine glass surface. "Your email was intriguing. You believe your property is of significant mutual benefit. Tell me why." There it was, the opening move. Margaret had prepared for this. She had spent the night rehearsing not just what she would say, but how she would say it. She would not be a grieving mother seeking revenge. She would be a strategic partner proposing a transaction. "You know why, Miss Vance," Margaret began, her voice even. "You know the Peterson project is functionally landlocked. You know their entire schematic for the Hudson Rise Estates hinges on securing an access easement through one of 3 properties. You know 2 of those are functionally unobtainable, and you know the third is mine." Alana's expression didn't change, but Margaret saw a flicker of something in her pale eyes. Respect. "I know what the public filings say," Alana conceded, a subtle test. "But public filings don't tell the whole story. Why sell to me? Your son is a principal on that project. Family loyalty, sentiment, these things usually command a premium I am not inclined to pay." Margaret met her gaze without wavering. This was the critical moment. She had to sever the emotional connection, to reframe the entire narrative from a family drama to a business opportunity. "Let's be clear, Miss Vance. My son's involvement is not a factor in this negotiation, or if it is a liability, not an asset." The words felt clean and cold in her mouth. Benjamin Scott made a critical business error. He built a 9-figure development plan on an assumption he never bothered to verify. He assumed my property, my life, was a passive asset he would one day control. He confused a maternal relationship with a binding property agreement. That is not sentiment, that is sloppy due diligence. And his sloppiness has created an opportunity. Alana Vance leaned back in her chair, a slow, genuine smile finally touching her lips. It transformed her face, making her look less like a shark and more like a wolf who had just cornered its prey. "An opportunity," she repeated, savoring the word. "I like that. So let's talk about this opportunity. You've listed the house. What's your asking price?" "My asking price with my realtor is a fiction designed for the public market. It is irrelevant to this conversation. You are not buying a house, Miss Vance. You are buying a kingmaker. You're buying the key that unlocks the adjacent parcel for your own development, and more importantly, the padlock that permanently blocks your primary competitor from theirs. You are buying victory, and that has a different price." The silence in the room was electric. Alana's smile widened. She had expected a negotiation over market value, perhaps a sob story she would have to endure before getting down to brass tacks. She had not expected this. She had not expected a peer. "All right, M. Waters," she said, the subtle shift in name a sign of her altered perception. "Let's talk about this opportunity. You've listed the house. What's your asking price?" "My asking price with my realtor is a fiction designed for the public market. It is irrelevant to this conversation. You are not buying a house, Miss Vance. You are buying a kingmaker. You are buying the key that unlocks the adjacent parcel for your own development, and more importantly, the padlock that permanently blocks your primary competitor from theirs. You are buying victory. And that has a different price." The silence in the room was electric. Alana's smile widened. She had expected a negotiation over market value, perhaps a sob story she would have to endure before getting down to brass tacks. She had not expected this. She had not expected a peer. "All right, M. Waters," she said, the subtle shift in name a sign of her altered perception. "Let's talk about this opportunity. You've listed the house. What's your asking price?" "My asking price with my realtor is a fiction designed for the public market. It is irrelevant to this conversation. You are not buying a house, Miss Vance. You are buying a kingmaker. You are buying the key that unlocks the adjacent parcel for your own development, and more importantly, the padlock that permanently blocks your primary competitor from theirs. You are buying victory. And that has a different price." The silence in the room was electric. Alana's smile widened. She had expected a negotiation over market value, perhaps a sob story she would have to endure before getting down to brass tacks. She had not expected this. She had not expected a peer. "All right, M. Waters," she said, the subtle shift in name a sign of her altered perception. "Let's talk about this opportunity. You've listed the house. What's your asking price?" "My asking price with my realtor is a fiction designed for the public market. It is irrelevant to this conversation. You are not buying a house, Miss Vance. You are buying a kingmaker. You are buying the key that unlocks the adjacent parcel for your own development, and more importantly, the padlock that permanently blocks your primary competitor from theirs. You are buying victory. And that has a different price." The silence in the room was electric. Alana's smile widened. She had expected a negotiation over market value, perhaps a sob story she would have to endure before getting down to brass tacks. She had not expected this. She had not expected a peer. "All right, M. Waters," she said, the subtle shift in name a sign of her altered perception. "Let's talk about this opportunity. You've listed the house. What's your asking price?" "My asking price with my realtor is a fiction designed for the public market. It is irrelevant to this conversation. You are not buying a house, Miss Vance. You are buying a kingmaker. You are buying the key that unlocks the adjacent parcel for your own development, and more importantly, the padlock that permanently blocks your primary competitor from theirs. You are buying victory. And that has a different price." The silence in the room was electric. Alana's smile widened. She had expected a negotiation over market value, perhaps a sob story she would have to endure before getting down to brass tacks. She had not expected this. She had not expected a peer. "All right, M. Waters," she said, the subtle shift in name a sign of her altered perception. "Let's talk about this."
The 2 days following the publication of the article were a steady and escalating panic. Margaret's phone became a relentless harbinger of her son's unraveling. The initial flurry of angry, disbelieving calls gave way to a barrage of texts that toggled between desperate pleading and wounded accusation. "Mom, you have to call me. This is a nightmare. Vance is leveraging this to kill the deal. Peterson's investors are spooked. How could you do this to me? To your own son. This was my entire future. Please, I'm begging you. There has to be a way to undo this. We can talk to Vance. I'll do anything. Is this what you wanted? To ruin me? Congratulations." Margaret read each message with the detached calm of a meteorologist observing a Category 5 hurricane from a secure bunker. She saw his fear, his desperation, his complete inability to comprehend his own culpability in the disaster. He still saw himself as the victim of her irrational rage, not the author of his own misfortune. She deleted every message, every voicemail, without a single reply. Her silence was a vacuum, and she knew it was driving him mad. He was firing his emotional ammunition into an empty room, and the ricochets were all hitting him. She spent those 2 days methodically sorting through 35 years of accumulated life, not with nostalgia, but with the ruthless efficiency of an auditor. She rented a small, climate-controlled storage unit. Into it went a handful of items she deemed worthy of preservation: a box of Benjamin's most charming childhood drawings, the ones untainted by later complexities, her grandmother's pearl necklace, her own journals from the past 20 years, a chronicle of her slow erasure that she now saw as a vital legal record of her own case against herself. Everything else, the furniture he'd promised to help her move, the china she'd saved for his future wife, the sports trophies he'd worried about, was tagged with colored stickers for an estate sale company she had hired. She was liquidating her past with the same unsentimental precision she had used to liquidate her house. On the third day, she knew he would come. He was out of options. His digital barrage had failed. His proxies, Richard and Christine, were likely in their own foxhole, deflecting his panic and assigning blame. He would have to face her himself. He arrived just after dusk, as the sky was bruising into a deep purple. He didn't ring the bell. He used the key he still had, a small act of residual entitlement that she had anticipated. The sound of it turning in the lock was loud in the silent house. He stepped into the foyer and stopped dead. The house was a ghost of itself. The warm, familiar living room was stark and cavernous. The Persian rug was gone. The armchairs were gone. The mantelpiece was bare. The only furniture remaining was the dining room table and 2 chairs, sitting under the chandelier like an interrogation stage. Dust motes danced in the fading light, illuminating the pale squares on the walls where pictures had once hung. Margaret was sitting at the table, a cup of tea before her. She wasn't wearing her armor of gray suiting, but a simple black cashmere sweater and slacks. She looked calm, poised, and utterly immovable. She stared at her face a mask of disbelief and fury. She looked thinner than she'd seen him in years, his expensive suit rumpled, dark circles under his green eyes. He looked, she thought, with a flicker of detached pity, like a man who hadn't slept since he read the news. "How could you do this?" he finally managed to say, his voice a hoarse whisper. He waved a hand at the empty room, at the wreckage of his childhood. "How could you do this?" "Hello, Benjamin," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the echoing space. "I see you let yourself in." The mild observation seemed to enrage him. "My key still works, apparently. Unlike my career, which you've just gleefully detonated. You did this deliberately. You went to Vance. You planned this just to ruin me." Margaret took a slow sip of her tea, her movements measured and calm. She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Sit down, Benjamin. Let's not shout. The neighbors have been through enough." He hesitated, then slumped into the chair, his body deflating as if the strings holding him upright had been cut. He dropped his briefcase to the floor with a heavy thud. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Just tell me why. Was it about the Mother's Day post? Was all of this scorched earth campaign really over one stupid Instagram picture?" Margaret set her cup down and looked at him, truly looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years without the softening filter of maternal love. She saw a man-child, accustomed to getting his way, now utterly bewildered by a world that had suddenly refused to bend to his will. "The Instagram post wasn't the cause, Benjamin. It was the diagnosis. It was the moment the X-ray came back and showed me the extent of a disease I had been ignoring for years. It was the symptom that revealed the sickness." "Sickness? What are you talking about? You're the one who's sick. You're having a breakdown. Dad was right."
No, she said, her voice firm, cutting through his panic. The sickness was our relationship. It was an arrangement built on my unconditional giving and your unconditional taking. It was a system where I was expected to provide limitless love, support, and forgiveness, and you were expected to provide nothing. You treated my love not as a gift to be cherished, but as a utility, like electricity or running water, something you were entitled to, something you only noticed when it was shut off. He stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. That's not true. I love you. Do you? She asked, a genuine philosophical question. Or do you love the idea of me? Do you love the security of having a mother, a permanent, indestructible safety net who would always be there to catch you, to clean up your messes, to make you feel better about yourself? You don't love Margaret Waters, the person. You don't know her. You haven't asked her a meaningful question about her life, her dreams, her fears, in over a decade. You love a function. You love an emotional service provider. And when that service was interrupted, you didn't try to understand why. You simply tried to get it turned back on. Her words hung in the air between them, stark and undeniable. He had no response. He just shook his head, a gesture of helpless denial. This house, she continued, gesturing to the empty space around them, was part of that utility. You didn't see it as my home, my sanctuary, my largest financial asset. You saw it as an extension of yourself, a place to store your old things, a piece of your past, and, as I discovered, a critical component of your business future. You factored my home into your biggest career move without even the courtesy of a conversation. You assumed it was yours to use. The color drained from his face. You know about the easement? How? I did my research, something you failed to do. You built your future on a foundation you didn't own, Benjamin. You assumed my compliance. You assumed my life was a subplot in the grand story of your success. The sale of this house wasn't an act of revenge. It was an act of sovereignty. It was me reminding you that I am not a subplot. I am the lead character in my own story. And you, it turns out, were just a supporting player. A supporting player? He choked out incredulously. I'm your son. And I am your mother, she countered. A role you publicly auditioned a replacement for. You made your choice. You chose Christine as your real mother. I simply decided to honor your choice. I have abrogated the role. A real mother, as you defined it, is someone who teaches you what family means. So let me teach you. Family is not a one-way street. Love is not an entitlement program. Actions have consequences. The word hung in the air. Consequences. It was a concept his life had largely insulated him from. His father's money, his own charm, and her endless capacity for forgiveness had always been there to buffer the blows. Now he was facing it head-on, in a cavernous, empty room with the architect of his ruin sitting calmed before him. My business, it's gone, he whispered, his voice hollow. Vance used the sale to create a panic clause with Peterson's investors. They pulled their funding this morning. The whole project collapsed. I'm facing lawsuits from subcontractors. I'll have to declare bankruptcy. Yes, Margaret said, simply. There was no triumph in her voice, only the flat finality of a fact. And Dad, and Christine, their marriage is falling.
She did not rush to fill the silence. Instead, she let it seep into her bones. She spent her days walking, exploring the city, not as a tourist taking off sights, but as a resident learning the rhythm of her new home. She discovered the cadence of the city's breath, the morning rush of locals grabbing a quick coffee and a pastry, the long, somnolent pause of the afternoon siesta, the slow, vibrant awakening of the evening as the tapas bars began to fill, and the late-night hum of conversation and laughter that spilled from open doorways. She learned to navigate the Mercado de la Paz, not with the hesitant pointing of a foreigner, but with the growing confidence of a regular. She learned the names of the different types of jamon, the subtle differences between manchego cheeses, and how to ask the fishmonger for the freshest merluza. Her Spanish, rusty from decades of disuse, began to return, slowly at first, then with increasing fluency. Each successful transaction, each shared pleasantry with the shopkeeper was a small victory, a brick laid in the foundation of her new identity. She enrolled in an intensive language course at a small, private institute. Her classmates were a mix of young international students and relocated business executives. In that classroom, she was not a mother, not an ex-wife, not a woman of a certain age with a complicated past. She was simply Margaret, a student, a beginner. She found a deep and unexpected joy in the simple act of learning, in the humility of making mistakes, and the quiet pride of mastering a new subjunctive verb. Her son, her past life, was a ghost she refused to entertain. She had changed her phone number before leaving the U.S., and her new Spanish number was given to no one from her previous life. Her lawyer, David Reisman, was her only link, a firewalled emissary instructed to handle the final administrative threads of her old existence, the estate sale, the closing of accounts, and to contact her only in the event of a dire life or death emergency, a category she privately defined with an extremely high threshold. 1 month after her arrival, David sent a single terse email. Subject: Final update. Margaret, the estate sale is complete. All accounts closed. The trust has been funded as per your instructions. There is one final matter. Benjamin Scott has, through his attorneys, made a formal request for information regarding the trust. He seeks to understand its terms and purpose. He has also requested a means of contacting you. I have declined both requests, citing client confidentiality and your explicit instructions. I await your guidance on whether this position should be maintained. Regards, David. Margaret stared at the email, a faint, bitter taste in her mouth. Even now, brought to his knees, Benjamin's first instinct was to probe the financial mechanics of her departure, to understand the terms of her severance package. His request for contact felt less like a son's plea and more like a shareholder's demand for information. Her reply to David was as concise as his email had been. David, maintain the position. There will be no further guidance because there will be no change. Margaret. She hit send and then, in a final act of severance, created a filter in her email account that automatically routed any message from David Reisman into a separate folder labeled Archive, which she would not open. The firewall was now complete. She was truly on her own. Her life began to take on a beautiful, unhermied shape. Her mornings were for language classes. Her afternoons were for what she came to think of as cultural homework. She would spend hours in the Prado Museum, not rushing through, but choosing a single gallery, sometimes a single painting, and truly studying it. She stood before Goya's black paintings, the dark, haunting works created in the artist's own later life isolation, and felt not despair, but a profound sense of kinship. Here was an artist who had looked into the abyss and had not flinched, but had painted what he saw with brutal honesty. She felt that same honesty taking root in herself. She found a small, family-run cafe, the Café Commercial, with worn marble tables and waiters in starched white jackets who had worked there for 40 years. It became her regular spot. She would sit for hours with a café con leche in her grammar textbook, and eventually the waiters began to greet her with a familiar nod. One of them, a courtly older gentleman named Javier, started a conversation with her one afternoon, gently correcting her Spanish and asking her what had brought an American woman like her to Madrid alone. "I came to learn," she'd replied simply. "Ah," he'd said, his eyes crinkling, "a student of life, the best kind. Most people stop learning after 30. Through Javier, she met others, a retired university professor who invited her to a weekly literary discussion group, a widowed art historian named Sofia, who became her companion on museum visits. These were not friendships forged from shared history or social obligation. They were connections based on mutual interests, on conversation, on the simple pleasure of each other's company. Her new friends only knew her as Margaret, the thoughtful American with the surprisingly good grasp of Spanish literature and a quiet, formidable intelligence. They never asked about her children or her past marriages. Her life began with her arrival in Madrid, and it was enough. 6 months into her new life, she had a visitor. She was returning to her apartment after her morning class when she saw him standing across the street, staring up at her building. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it was Benjamin. The figure was tall, well-dressed, American. But as he turned, she realized it wasn't him. It was Richard. Her ex-husband looked older, smaller, and deeply out of place on the elegant Madrid street. His expensive suit was wrinkled from travel, and his face, usually ruddy with self-satisfaction, was pale and drawn. He saw me, and he took a hesitant step forward. Margaret did not run. She did not hide. She simply stood on the pavement, her bag of groceries in her hand, and waited. She felt no fear, no anger, but only a weary sense of inevitability. "Margaret," he said when he reached me, his voice rough. I had to find you. I hired a private investigator. Cost a fortune." "I imagine it did," I replied, my voice cool. "What do you want, Richard?" "I want to talk. Please, just 5 minutes." She studied his face. The bluster was gone. The arrogance had been replaced by a raw, unfamiliar desperation. Against her better judgment, a flicker of curiosity stirred. She gave a curt nod towards a small cafe on the corner. "There, you have 5 minutes." They sat at a small outdoor table. The waiter came, and Margaret ordered a coffee in fluent Spanish. Richard just stared at her, dumbfounded. "Your Spanish is good," he mumbled. "One finds time for new hobbies when one's schedule opens up," she said dryly. He flinched. "Margaret, I came here to tell you that Benjamin is not well. He's a mess. He's a mess. The bankruptcy was finalized last month. He lost everything. He's living in a small rental apartment, drowning in debt. He's drinking too much. He won't talk to me. He won't talk to anyone." Margaret listened without expression, her hands wrapped around Fee. "And this is my concern because?" "Because he's your son," Richard burst out, a flash of his old anger returning. "Don't you care at all?" "I care a great deal," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a low, intense level that made him lean in. "I care that my son became a man who was so arrogant and so careless that he gambled his entire future on the assumption of his mother's lifelong servitude. I care that he was so emotionally stunted that his response to a perceived slight was to publicly humiliate the woman who raised him. And I care that his reaction to facing the consequences of his actions is not to rebuild his character, but to retreat into a bottle. I care about all of that, but I am no longer responsible for fixing it." Richard slumped in his chair, defeated. "Christine left me," he said,
his voice barely a whisper. She said she couldn't live with the guilt. She said our whole life was built on a foundation of cruelty. She said you were right. You exposed us. I exposed nothing, Margaret said gently. I just walked out of the room. The structure fell on its own. He needs you, Margaret. He needs his mother. Margaret looked at her ex-husband, at this man she had once loved, this man who had been her partner and creating the very person who had caused her so much pain. She saw, for the first time, not a villain, but a man just as trapped in his own flawed narrative as she had been. No,